All right, at long last, much anticipated, we are joined now by David Sirota, who, of course, is founder of Lever News, among many other things, and is out with a new book. David, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. So let's put the book jacket up on the screen here. Guys need to make sure to check this out. You guys have been doing phenomenal work on corruption in America in particular. The title of the book is Master Plan, The Hidden Plot to Legalize Corruption in America. David, let's start with this news that's incredibly relevant. We put up on the screen here about one of the cases that's going before the Supreme Court, or actually is it two cases that are going before the Supreme Court that, listen, we already don't have the greatest campaign finance system. There already aren't a lot of limits, but there's an effort afoot to try to eliminate what meager limits we do have. So explain that to the audience for us.
So we're at the 15-year anniversary of Citizens United, and Citizens United was the culmination of this movement that we document in Master Plan. And I should say we call it the hidden plot, and people think they know this story, but trust me, you do not know the story of how corruption was legalized because it's been secret for decades. And we uncovered all sorts of documents exposing how they wrote it down. I mean, right, they wrote down how they were going to deregulate the campaign finance system and weaken anti-bribery laws. Americans in polls tell us that they hate the Citizens United decision, but as you allude to, the Supreme Court is literally right now going to hear a case that could dismantle whatever was left of America's anti-corruption laws after Citizens United. And it's a case spearheaded by J.D. Vance. So essentially what this case would do, what J.D. Vance is trying to do, is say that parties, the limits on how much parties can coordinate their spending with candidates should be essentially eliminated, which the effect of that would be, the reason the rules exist is to prevent what would end up being, if this happens, which is that donors could simply funnel much larger amounts of money through parties to candidates, essentially using parties as a kind of shell corporation or a pass-through entity to flood much more money directly to candidates. So not even through supposedly independent super PACs. We're talking about much larger amounts of money directly into candidates. And the other case that's going on right now is a case that's trying to narrow the enforceability of anti-corruption laws. This is the line of rulings like the Bob McDonnell ruling, the Bridgegate rulings. So further narrowing it, there's an appeal at the court that cites, remember the story of Donald Trump soliciting $1 billion reportedly of campaign contributions from oil executives in exchange for promising favors. This appeal at the Supreme Court cites that situation to say, look at this, pay-to-play culture is now so pervasive that essentially we need to make it unprosecutable because pay-to-play culture is now essentially what politics is.
That's insane.
So
that's
if
the opposite of the way you should view that situation.
Exactly. I mean, it literally says, imagine if prosecutors prosecuted this kind of quid pro quo corruption, this would essentially criminalize all of politics.
Yes, imagine
that's where we are.
Wow.
Well, you also talk about Ferraris there in the article. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, so that's part of the case. That's one of the cases in this line of cases to weaken the enforceability of anti-corruption laws and anti-bribery laws. That quote from John Roberts, where he says, this case is not having to deal with the tawdry details of Ferraris and Rolexes. It's about and this is his words, the overzealous, and I'm paraphrasing here, the overzealous enforcement by federal prosecutors of anti-bribery laws. That's the court's posture here. And it's worth noting that the court has been issuing these rulings, making it harder and harder to prosecute bribery, while certain members of the court are accepting lavish gifts from billionaires with business before the court. So in a certain sense, they kind of have an interest in making sure that bribery and this kind of corruption is unprosecutable.
That is such an important point, and one that doesn't go remarked upon enough. I did want to give people a little bit of good news here, though, because I saw you were talking on Twitter about how, the commonly held belief is like, well, after Citizens United, there's not a lot we can do about campaign finance or require a constitutional amendment. We all know how likely that is to happen. But you've actually been doing some investigating, and there may be actually some ways that individual states can help curb the corrupt influence of money in their politics.
Yeah, so this is actually some good news. In Montana, luminaries of both parties are pushing a ballot measure that takes a look at how to deal with money in politics in a different way than standard campaign contribution limits or disclosure requirements. The long and the short of it is that the idea that corporations are people that are entitled to the rights to free speech, with money being defined as speech. The whole idea that corporations are people stems from state incorporation laws that deems them or grants them the same powers as people under the law. The Citizens United case, all the campaign finance cases rely on those state incorporation laws. Mm-hmm. So what's happening in Montana is there's a ballot measure to say, okay, if that's the case, then we can change our state laws to grant corporations certain powers, but not grant them other powers. Legal scholars will tell you that the corporations under the law are artificial entities created by state laws, which means, and we've done this in the past, way back, where we said, corporations have this as part of their charter. They have this power, and they don't have this power. Mm-hmm. In Montana, what they're proposing to do is say they have all the powers that they have, but they do not have the power to spend in elections. And here's the thing. I know people listening to this probably saying, well, doesn't it mean that a company could just move out of Montana and move to Delaware and then do what it wants? Well, the answer is not inside the state, because all state laws have a provision that essentially say, if you're an out-of-state company doing business in our state, you must comply with the basic laws and powers that we grant to corporations in state. So the point is, Montana doing this can change its situation for Montana. It doesn't have to wait for other states to move forward with this. And of course, then you extend it. You say, well, listen, states, blue states that are more inclined to do this right now don't have to wait to do it on their ballot. They could do it through their legislature. So I think what they're looking at in Montana is a template. And the thing is that the Supreme Court just recently and over many decades continues to have ruled that how corporations are treated flows from state law. And my point in saying that is that this is a way to use Supreme Court precedent to deal with the problem in a way that the Supreme Court has previously and repeatedly said is within what it considers okay under the law.
Very
really interesting. So, David, how does this connect to the upcoming midterm elections?
Well, look, I think it's not. It's on the ballot in the midterm elections. So I think it's not going to be in place before the midterm elections. But look, I think the Democrats have a big problem in the midterm elections on the corruption issue, and I wrote about this recently, which is to say that in 2016, the last poll before the election showed Donald Trump losing on every issue except for corruption. If you can believe it, here in 2025, the most recent Reuters poll showed the Republicans have a similar lead on the issue of corruption as they did in 2016. Who do you trust to deal with corruption? The Republicans are actually leading the Democrats. And I think that's a huge problem for the midterms, because clearly it means the Democrats have not made a forceful case about how they are, whether or not they are serious about cleaning up corruption. And I think part of the problem here is that a lot of their anti-corruption argument is a purely anti-Trump argument. And it's not willing to concede the system is corrupt. And if you remember the John McCain race, I think back to that a lot, the 2000 John McCain race, where John McCain at one point almost won the Republican nomination. I would argue that the reason his anti-corruption message, and it was a pure anti-corruption message, the reason it resonated was because he was willing to talk about both parties. And I think a lot of voters saw that as you're willing to be authentic and speak honestly about the situation, as opposed to just blaming one side for the problem.
Yeah, gave him his sort of maverick branding. Let's talk a little bit about a little more about the midterm. So there's this other Supreme Court case where it looks like the Supreme Court is poised to strike down additional aspects of, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act. Let's go ahead and take a listen to Harry Enton talk about the impact that this could have on the midterms.
Okay, so, if you go back 6 months ago, you go back to April, Kate Baldwin, what were we looking at? Well, we were looking at the Democrats with a very clear shot of taking control of the U.S. House of Representatives, according to the Kalshi prediction market odds. We saw them at an 83% chance. But those odds have gone plummeting down. Now we're talking about just a 63% chance, while the GOP's chances up like a rocket, up like gold, up from 17% to now a 37% chance. So we'll look like a pretty clear, likely Democratic win in the House come next year has become much closer to a toss-up at this point, although still slightly leaning Democratic.
What's changed? What are you saying?
You go back to April, look at the generic congressional ballot. What you see? You see +3 Democrats in 2025 in April. You see +3 Democrats back in April of 2017. Now jump over to this side of the screen. What happens? Well, the Democrats are no longer keeping pace with the pace that they were setting back in 2017, 2018. You look back in 2017, you saw that the Democrats had leaped up to an 8-point advantage. If both sides max out, we're probably looking at a GOP gain of +7 House seats. That doesn't even take into account the potential gutting of the VRA that is right now going to be in front of the Supreme Court. If you add that in, you could be looking...
The Voting Rights Act.
What? Yes, exactly right. The Voting Rights Act. If you add that in, then you could be looking about adding 10, 12, 15, 17 on top of this 7 seats.
So Nate Cohn of the New York Times did an analysis here and said basically if Republicans really max out what they could do with that section of the Voting Rights Act being, nullified by the Supreme Court, Democrats would need to win the popular vote by like more than 5 points to even have a prayer of winning back control of the House. So talk a little bit about that case and what, some of the details there and what you think the impact could be.
Yeah, so the case is basically making it easier to gerrymander. I mean, that's the top line for especially in Republican states. It basically would say that districts that are drawn in accordance with the old Voting Rights Act or the existing Voting Rights Act, districts drawn to make sure there is adequate minority representation, that provision would essentially become unenforceable if not eliminated. And what that would mean for various districts with African-American members of Congress and the like, that it would eliminate, or at least Republican legislatures would be empowered to eliminate more of those districts in a way that increases their chances of winning those districts. And essentially what it would say, it would make it harder to prove or harder to get the law enforced to say that a specific map was violating essentially the basic civil rights that were outlined in the Voting Rights Act. It would raise the threshold. So I do think it's true. The upshot here is, are Republican states with Republican legislatures and Republican governors, if this ruling comes down, are they going to call emergency sessions to redraw their maps? I think we should assume a lot of them are. And I want to bring it back to what we reveal in our book, which is master plan, which is, look, you have to understand so much of this comes out of that early 1970s era where you've got conservatives saying, look, and this is in the Powell memo, look, we have a problem where the government has become too responsive to what people want. This is essentially what Lewis Powell, the Supreme Court justice, was arguing in the infamous Powell memo. And what it was really saying is democracy has become a problem for us. So we need more investment in essentially electing who we want, corporations, oligarchs, and the like, to prevent the people from getting so much of what they want because it's threatening our so-called free market system. So you've seen that in the deregulation of campaign finance. That's one pillar. You're now seeing it in the attempt to change the maps, right? Change the process, the way we elect people. You've seen it in the attack on unions, right? These are the 3 pillars that we have to stop the public from getting what it wants. So I look at the redistricting stuff as one pillar of this larger plan to to reduce the power of people to essentially get what they want from government, because the people in power with money don't want that. They see that responsiveness as a threat.
What I found interesting after Citizens United, David, is there was a lot of talk about, I think correctly, about a lot of Republican billionaires who would take advantage. It ended up actually being quite bipartisan, including unions, many others who used it much to their advantage. I wonder if you could talk about that in the context of, this as well, specifically with California talking about redistricting, and whether you see that as the acceptable balance. Like, what's a better end state? Because I think that's what you're trying to get at.
No, it's a fair question. Look, in my view, what California is doing on its redistricting ballot measure is a response to what the Republicans started. I think that's obvious.
Yeah.
Do I think it's a good thing? Like, do I think an arms race of gerrymandering is a good thing? No, it's a very bad thing. This is where I think we don't want to go, but it is where we are. How to put this all back in the bottle? I mean, that's the big question. I mean, I do look to a place as an example like New York City with Zoran Mamdani, and I say, here is a something we can look at as a potential solution. And I want to be clear about what I'm saying. I'm not saying Zoran Mamdani is the solution. Mm-hmm. What I'm saying is there's been a debate about how did Zoran Mamdani, as an example, win a Democratic primary against all of that money in the financial and media capital of the world. Was it that he was a compelling candidate? Or was it his slick ads? Was it a great message? All of those things are important. But the thing that, to my mind, that was most important was that New York City has a system of public financing of elections, which allowed him to get enough resources to be competitive, not enough to outspend his opponents, but enough to be competitive. And I look at systems of public financing of elections, which are operate in about 20 cities and a couple of states, and I say, this is a way that if you want, I don't care if you're a Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal, if you want candidates who come from outside of the system of private financing, of donations coming in with the expectation of legislative favors, then we should be looking at those systems as a way to do that. And look, Congress has gotten very close at various points to creating public financing systems of elections for Congress. It was first proposed, an old idea, it was first proposed by Teddy Roosevelt. So my point in bringing this up is, and we talked about the Montana situation, we're going to have to start thinking like way outside of the box. If you've got J.D. Vance at the Supreme Court saying we got to dismantle what's left of what was left after Citizens United, of traditional old campaign finance laws, it's time to actually take a look at how do we actually change the entire system, change state and corporation laws, public financing of elections. Like, that's where the discussion actually needs to be.
Yeah.
Really thought-provoking.
How do we get away from plutocracy and towards something approximating like majoritarian representation, democratic representation? David, thank you so much for your reporting. Tell people again, remind them book title and where to find it.
Yeah, it's called Master Plan. It's the hidden plot to legalize corruption. Again, you may think you know this story. Like, I've gotten people, I already know everything's corrupt. Like, trust me, you do not know. These are never before published documents, photos, transcripts, and you can find the book at levernews.com/book. And I just want to say thanks to both of you for having us on to discuss it. And one of the things I talk about that we talk about in the book is, the infiltration of media by the same Powell memo billionaires and corporations. Mm-hmm. We have seen that of late, or sort of a culmination of that. Yeah. And independent media, the rise of it right now, is also one of those things that I look at as an optimistic development. And you guys are really, really a huge part of that.
Wow. That's really nice of you. Thank you very much, David.
We feel very much the same about you and the important work that you're doing out there. So thank you so much. Great to see you, David.
See you, man.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for watching, guys. We appreciate it. Friday show tomorrow. They'll see you then. Hey, if you like that video, hit the like button or leave a comment below. It really helps get the show to more people.
And if you'd like to get the full show ad-free and in your inbox every morning, you can sign up at breakingpoints.com.
That's right. Get the full show, help support the future of independent media at breakingpoints.com.